All right, it's tax day up on Capitol Hill, so quite naturally, we're here with a senior tax policy advisor, Jacob Leibenluft, who is going to answer any of the questions that you've got about this Republican tax plan. What's your major takeaway from this?
We're still looking through the details of the legislation and trying to understand the numbers, but I think the first takeaway is, if you are super wealthy or a big corporation or own a lot of stock in a big corporation, you do really well under this. Everyone else, not so much. We're hearing a lot today from the Hill about a tax cut for the middle class. The truth is that millions of people are left out altogether. We look about maybe 35% of people get nothing because even though they pay payroll taxes, they pay state taxes, but because they don't pay federal income tax, they're left out altogether. And then a bunch of middle class people, some may get a little bit, but many people are seeing deductions taken away, their personal exemptions taken away. And so if they get anything, it's not much. And meanwhile, you have this massive windfall to the top that ultimately will have consequences for everybody.
So let's talk about the dynamics of what we were talking about earlier, the state and local taxes. Sure. So currently, the way it works, whenever you pay your state and local taxes and your property taxes, you can write most of that off, if not all of that off, on your federal taxes, which only seems fair. You paid the government. I have to pay the government again. And so out of fairness, that's been the practice. Most blue states tend to have higher taxes than red states, higher social outcomes as a result. We can discuss whether or not those things are correlated or caused. But so as a result, these blue states will be under a ton of pressure to lower their taxes, taking money away from the middle class people that benefit from those exemptions and using the money that they're taking away from those middle class people, funneling it up to the top. Is that basically the flow of money here?
That's basically right. So you have those giant tax cuts. In order to make their plan add up, they need to find deductions to get rid of. And they've decided that a place they want to go is these state and local tax deductions. Part of that is because it does affect blue states more, and so that's attractive to Republicans. And part of it is this ideological sense.
But really, it's anybody that pays property in state.
That's true. So it will affect every state.
So it hurts people in New Jersey more.
Absolutely.
But
that's a really important point, which is that you'll hear about this affecting blue states. It affects everybody. It just disproportionately affects states that have chosen to spend a little bit more on education or other public services. And so what you'll see here is, again, this idea that, they need to find a place to get the money to pay for these big tax cuts at the top, and this ideological sense that anything we can do to make it less attractive for states to have a more robust income tax, we'd like to remove that incentive, and that's part of why they've gone this direction.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. It's not a bug that New Jersey and New York and California will be under pressure to lower their tax rates. It is a feature of the plan. They want state taxes to be lower. And
that's exactly right. And so I think what it means is that if you care about, let's say, spending on education or healthcare, this is really a double whammy, right? You're going to see federal spending likely on those programs cut eventually to pay for the tax cuts, but also you're going to see state spending cut in order to adjust to this new system.
So I get ideologically why they would want to do that, but politically, the last time anybody was able to put through a tax cut, George W. Bush. Sure. Twice, right? 2001 and 2003?
Yeah, and some in 2004 too.
Well, this guy loved cutting taxes. I don't remember that being the case. Right. How did he get his through Congress?
So, George W. Bush took a slightly different approach to what we're seeing now. His tax cuts were overwhelmingly, with a couple of exceptions, on the individual side. So he wasn't primarily looking to do corporate tax cuts. These were high-income individual tax cuts. But he made a decision, and his advisors made a decision, that they were going to provide these temporary tax cuts that expired, overwhelmingly tilted towards the wealthy, but also have some specific tax cuts that they could show to lower and middle income people to give the impression that everyone would benefit. Now, obviously, what we saw, in fact, was that these tax cuts were incredibly expensive. They didn't do what was promised for the economy, but politically, it was a relatively, easy move in the short term because they could sell these across-the-board tax cuts. The plan right now that we're seeing is quite a bit more complicated.
And right, so right, exactly. Bush didn't say, well, I'm going to lower your mortgage deduction. I'm going to come after your property tax. I'm going to hit all these things. And Bush also was not operating in the age of Twitter. So if you've been following the conversation throughout the day, what you notice is people flagging little things, putting them up on Twitter. So Twitter kind of acting like a sniper, looking across the bill for something that's kind of a toxic deduction closure or removal, and then just people just piling on it. One I saw was there is a deduction for people basically who are giving money to a college to be able to purchase football tickets. And they're able to write off like 80% of that. Now, if I were writing the tax code, I wouldn't write that into the tax code, but I don't care a ton either. So there's nobody passionately opposed to that. But if you get that tax cut and if you know you get that tax break and now you're going to lose it, you're also probably somebody who knows your congressman.
Oh, absolutely.
Like if you're giving that kind of money to your local college, chances that the congressman has called you for a donation is about 100%.
No, I think that's exactly right. And so what we see here is that all of these little provisions matter a lot to somebody, and the people who get them. And so you'll see, the cost of them may not be that large compared to the overall size of our tax code, but for the people who get them, they could be a pretty big deal. Now, I think there's an important point to make, which is not all of the provisions that are getting taken away in this bill are all that great. Like the one you mentioned right here is probably something that, many of us who believe in a more progressive tax code would say that's fine to get rid of it. The problem is that what this bill does is it gets rid of these provisions all in order to pay for tax cuts for the ultra wealthy, to eliminate the estate tax, which only goes to the top 2 out of 1,000. Exactly. I mean, we had a chart of how many people per year pay the estate tax in different states, and I joked that I've had bagel brunches at my apartment with more people than get the estate tax in a lot of states. Like
I've heard that the census won't even release some of the data.
Some of them, you'll see it's like less than, I can't remember if it's 10 or 20, but the number is so small that in a given year, we're not even seeing, we can't even identify how many people benefit.
Or I've heard that they can identify them, but for privacy concerns, there's so few people.
Say that people will know, oh my God, this data is about, X person who died, and we don't want to release that information. Exactly. So I think this goes back to this point: is it doesn't just matter what things you're getting rid of; it matters what you're getting rid of it for. People really don't want to see themselves right. So this is the number of estates every year.
The first Bush tax cut right here.
So even then, we're talking about 50,000 or so estates a year. Not a giant problem unless you're super rich or hang out with people who are super rich. Even before this, you probably didn't know too many people were paying the estate tax. Now we go to here. In 2011, it actually went away altogether as a result of the Bush tax cuts. And then we're here in 2015, and we're talking about, I think it's around...
This was a great year to die.
No, and actually there's some literature that showed that people, like slightly more rich people died that year, which you could come to your own judgments about like how that happened exactly. But but in 2015, so the most recent year we have data, we're talking about, again.
Man, for the people, sorry to derail, but man, if your grandpa died on January 2nd, 2012, and he's a billionaire, man, you're so mad at him.
Totally. And so, there's, anyway, that's
you're paying off the corner to be like, you sure it wasn't December 31st?
There's movies to be written about this stuff. But so 2015, can't usually say that about tax policy, but so in 2015, you're seeing about 2 out of every 1,000 estates facing this. And that's about, I think it's about 5,500 people. You have to have an estate that's larger than $11 million. So unless your family has more than $11 million, estate tax doesn't even affect you at all. And meanwhile...
And they're doubling it to 22,
Doubling it to 22 and then getting rid of it altogether. And we're talking about a couple $100 billion over the next 10 years. That, could pay for all sorts of things that would benefit millions of people, and instead you're just benefiting that very small number of estates. And so I think part of what I think is complicated about the politics here is you're asking people to give up their tax deduction, their tax benefit, in order for, the 5,000 richest people to benefit. Right. And that's not a trade most people want to take.
And not just the 5,000 richest people, but their kids.
Exactly.
who are like the least sympathetic people. Like people hate them. People hate like the kid, the 40-year-old who's never done anything with his life and is now going to inherit, millions of dollars. Like people despise that person, and they're going to lose their deductions. They're going to have to pay more for their football tickets.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Or, in something that's more, they're going to have to pay, they're going to lose their deduction for student loan interest, or they're going to lose things that, again, maybe aren't hitting primarily low-income people. And so I think we can talk about whether even those deductions are the exact right way we want our tax code to be structured. But certainly this trade of getting rid of that kind of stuff for these benefits, it's just not a trade that is popular, and it's frankly a fast track to having really entrenched wealth that gets passed on generation by generation untaxed entirely.
Isabel Schmidt would like to know if this is going to increase the class divide in the U.S. if it's passed.
Well, look, I think the question is almost certainly yes, and I think there's a sort of technical way and a sort of broader way that you can think about this. One is, we have yet to see, because we're still working the math, what the so-called distribution of these tax cuts are going to be. But if it's anything like what we've modeled for similar plans before, the benefits are overwhelmingly going to the wealthy. So what you're going to see is that this bill in and of itself will increase income inequality. But I think there's a even in some ways more insidious thing that this does. If you're a wealthy investor, you can likely pass on your wealth to your heirs when you die, with much of that wealth never getting taxed at all. And so you never, because of ways that capital gains taxes are structured, basically, you start a company, or maybe not even start a company, you may have just invested in a company, or your parents, you inherited from your parents shares in a company. That goes up over the course of your life. You can then pass it on to your kids, and it never really gets taxed. And I think what that means for the concentration of wealth, what that means for the politics of wealth inequality is all pretty drastic, and I think it is something worth being concerned about.
Where do you think it's going to go? Like, there's about 20-ish Republicans from blue states who are under pressure not to screw their constituents. No quicker way to get people furious at you than, you pay more in April because of the guy that you voted for. But that's not enough. You need what? 20? The Republicans can lose about 23.
Yeah. And obviously they also have issues in the Senate too, where they can only stand to lose 2 Republicans.
And they've probably already lost who so far, you think?
I think their toughest vote so far is somebody like Bob Corker, who's been concerned about the impact on the deficit. Flake is another person who expressed concern, and obviously
neither of whom have any pressure. Yeah.
But I think we'll see more details of the bill, and that will reveal probably additional provisions that people find uncomfortable, to say the least. I think that we have 2 different factors at play. One is the incredible pressure to get something done. And you're seeing that's pressure that's being levied by donors. It's pressure that they are telling themselves that this is sort of an existential thing they need to do. The flip side is, I think as the numbers come out on this bill, it will become clear that it doesn't look all that great for their constituents, and especially these California and New York and New Jersey representatives who, they may see in particular that their constituents are hurt. And, again, you're asking their constituents to pay more on behalf of the people who are doing even better than them. And so I think the challenge for those of us who oppose this bill is to marshal the kind of outrage and anger that we saw around the health bill. I think that was really the core element here. The math on the health bill was hard, but the thing that meant they couldn't pass something was that they were seeing in their districts, on their phone lines, constant anger about the idea that, I might lose my Medicaid, my premiums might go up, I'm worried about the health of my family. And the question is, does that same passion come from constituents here? And I think that could be a real important element of whether or not this passes.
From Tony Buscemi, I saw the cap on the mortgage interest deduction, but $500,000 is high, and I don't think many middle-class taxpayers pay anything near that.
No, I think that's exactly right. We had expected going.
Correct me if I'm wrong. it's the amount of interest you pay on a $500,000 mortgage.
Correct.
Not
It's not $500,000 in interest.
right.
Yes.
Right. Now, not a lot of very few middle class people have a mortgage that's more than $500,000. But if you live in Washington or New York or California, you could very easily have more than that. And
I think this is going exactly to the dynamic we were discussing before, which is that a lot of the deductions that are being taken away in this bill may predominantly hit people who are, you could describe them as upper middle class or even sort of lower upper class. They're people who are doing pretty well compared to the average American. They're doing not nearly as well as the ultra wealthy. And I think that's the dynamic that we're seeing here in a way, is it's pitting people who are in the top 1 or top 0.1% versus people who are somewhat below them. And in some parts, again, a lot of this also depends on where you live in the country.
right. And part of it, I think, also has to do with social democracy. Even the people who have a $750,000 mortgage, let's say, people who have nowhere near that look at them and say, you're so rich. They feel like they're still paycheck to paycheck because they're a crisis away from not being able to meet that mortgage, losing the house, winding up. They'll still be probably better off than many other American people, but because there's no safety net and no real bonds of social democracy in this country, you have anxiety, within people that really should not have anxiety, and so you'll probably have a lot of anger from them about this capping it at 500. What's it at now? $1 million?
It's $1 million right now.
Okay. So yeah, so the answer to that question, it's not exactly right. Very few people pay $500,000 in interest a year. You'd have to have like a $10 million mortgage, right?
Right.
But it still doesn't hit everybody. However, the property tax part
it's hitting more
is
people,
also going to whack more people.
But again, I think the key thing is just, what is this all going towards? I mean, we could talk about, you might want to limit the amount of interest that people could deduct, and if we're using that to pay for, if we're using that to pay for affordable housing, that's a really interesting conversation to have. That's a very different conversation than the one we're having right now.
Right. You're taking the money from those folks so that you can cut corporate tax rate and cut the rate for Betsy DeVos's and right.
Okay, so this is from Bonnie Pesson, and I'm not sure I understand. Hopefully you will. She says, this gives $1,100, but lose my deductions. What a joke.
So the number that we've seen it from Speaker Ryan in particular today, they're saying this is an $1,100 tax cut for the typical family. And what they did is they took a particular example of somebody making about $60,000 a year with a couple of kids. They plugged in their numbers, and they obviously picked an example that looked pretty good for them, and they say there's an $1,100 tax cut. Now, it is true that there are some middle-class families who will get some tax cut out of this bill. But first of all,
especially if they live in a state like Florida, maybe, or Texas,
and especially if they have kids, there's a few. If you look at certain elements, you can craft those examples. But I think there are a couple things to remember. First of all, the tax cut they're getting is like mere pittance compared to what the wealthy is getting. Secondly, if they happen to take some of these itemized deductions we discussed, or they happen to have a different family composition, they may get less than $1,100 or nothing at all, or possibly pay more. And a third thing is that one key, most of this is all made permanent. Estate tax repeal, permanent. Corporate tax cut, permanent. There's a $300 credit that they're making a big deal about. That expires after 5 years. So they pick the one thing that goes to more families, not every family, but more families. They pick that to expire. The last thing I would just say is that who's paying for those high-income tax cuts ultimately? Again, this bill costs $1.5 trillion over the next 10 years. That's going to ultimately come out of programs that benefit that middle-income family. So that's ultimately going to be paid for by trying to cut Medicaid, cut Medicare, cut education spending. And so what you're going to see there is even those families who are getting a tax cut, that tax cut is likely going to be outweighed by the impact of losing programs they really count on.
Mike Lynn would like to know how Republican voters could come around to support something, and let's say they are very wealthy people.
Like, how do you get the regular Republican base to support it? You think he means?
Yeah. Own an oil company.
Right. Look, I think as we saw with the health bill, their only path to passing this is for people to not understand what's in it. And so we saw with the health bill that they would, wait till the last possible moment, drop the legislation, and try to immediately go towards a vote. There's a reason they're trying to get this done by Christmas. Christmas is not far. We're talking about less than 2 months away to pass a massive.
And people aren't paying a ton of attention with Thanksgiving coming and Christmas shopping and.
Exactly. So they're trying to pass a massive bill that's extremely complicated in a very short period of time, and that's by design. The goal here is for people to not understand what's in it. So I think the quick answer, frankly, is the only reason that legislators will feel comfortable voting for this is if they also believe their constituents don't understand the bill.
Tyler, who's a regular,
Tyler.
He wants to know about how this would affect the old 25% bracket that did not change.
It's a good question. And some, yeah, so I think what this question refers to is the fact that one of the changes in this bill is it changes both the levels of different tax brackets and slightly reduces the number of brackets, although it adds a whole set of complications. The quick answer, and this is unsatisfying, is we're still running the numbers to understand how everyone is affected. And, my guess is that if you're in or around the 25% bracket, how you're affected is going to depend on how many kids you have, whether you have mortgage interest that you deduct or state and local taxes that you deduct.
Bracket kick in?
I don't know off the top. I'd have to look up to know where where that bracket kicks in changes under this bill too. So I don't want to say it without having full confidence. But you're talking probably the 25% bracket. You're talking about sort of middle to upper middle income. If you're again depending on how much you deduct, which will change what bracket you're in. And so this is one of these cases where just depending on what your family looks like, where you live, and exactly what your expenses are, you could gain a little bit under this bill, or you could be losing under this bill. And we just aren't going to know until we plug in all those numbers.
Okay, so Lem Mason has a question that actually goes to some of the articles that TYT Investigates reporters were writing. UPS and FedEx lobbying for these tax cuts, saying they would be job creators, saying we'll create jobs if you give us a big windfall on taxes. But when they talk to their shareholders, they're saying this will be great. We can invest in technology that'll help us actually shed jobs. So what's the truth here?
Well, this has been. They started this bill. The main component and the main motivation is to have this large corporate tax cut. Everything else, that's like the original sin of this bill. And so part of the reason they're doing all this painful stuff is to make it all add up. And that means they have a huge incentive, the folks who are supporting this bill, to argue that average people, workers, benefit from corporate tax cuts. That's not what we see from the economic literature. That's not what we see from past experience. What we see is the vast majority of the gains from corporate tax cuts go to the people who own the companies. And that means investors in the United States, but also in many cases foreign investors who own a decent share of U.S. companies. And workers really don't get much at all. And so you may have seen the White House, for example, talking about how there's a $4,000 raise that people are going to get from this corporate tax cut. That's just out of line with what any serious economist believes. And in fact, I think there's a really open question as to whether corporate tax cuts help the economy at all. I think that's a real serious subject of debate of whether an unpaid for corporate tax cut would even grow the economy or could perhaps shrink the economy. And so this idea that companies are going to take this sort of windfall they get from this bill and use it to either hire more workers or give people raises is not consistent with past experience. And frankly, it's not all that logical when you look at their current levels of profitability or some of the incentives this bill would create to further shift profits and jobs overseas.
It's almost a funny suggestion.
Right.
Like it's so silly. Yeah, that a company would voluntarily just raise the amount of money that it gives to its workers because it can.
Right.
It's not what they do.
Okay. So August sounds like he's a Bob Corker fan. He's concerned about the deficit. And it brings me to a question, because when they say it's going to add what trillions of, you can tell us what the number is, it's always based on a projection, and they never say what the projection is. So is it going to add to the deficit, and how much?
Sure. So, and I'm going to try not to get super technical here because this can get kind of boring fast, but they're operating under a set of rules that basically allow them to add $1.5 trillion to the deficit over the next 10 years. So almost by definition, that's what they're basically crafting their bill to meet that $1.5 trillion target. And, it's very difficult to model these bills. So I don't want to, there's a nonpartisan body called the Joint Committee on Taxation that does, they run a bunch of complicated economic models and they estimate, how much will this provision raise? How much will this provision lose? How do those all interact? But, they do this as well as anybody does. And so I think it's reasonable to assume, because this is how the bill is being designed, that it is going to add not just $1.5 trillion, but at least that, because they're going to have a bunch of gimmicks to make it seem like it doesn't cost that much. And look, you can decide how much you are concerned about increasing the deficit itself. I think, what I'm most worried about is the fact that Republicans are simultaneously increasing the deficit as a result of this bill and saying our way of solving that higher deficit is cutting all of these other programs. They're not being secret about that. They're saying we are going to pass this bill, and then the next thing we're going to do is repeal the Affordable Care Act and cut Medicaid. And they passed a budget resolution that cuts Medicare and education. And name your program that you care about, they've probably indicated they want to cut it. And so that, to me, is the biggest concern, which is that it's not that they want to increase deficits forever. It's that they want to increase the deficit and pay for that in their next piece of legislation or the piece of legislation after that with programs that are actually really important for normal people.
Scott Johnson, and he's talking about the kinds of deductions that you can take and how that may change. Now we're getting really into the high tech.
Matters to people.
No, it does. And this is where, we're still trying to understand, this bill, we've been waiting almost a year under the Trump administration to see this bill. We've been waiting longer than that to get real details about tough choices that Republicans want to make. And, there are, they get rid of a deduction, I can't remember if it's a deduction or credit for people who have electric vehicles, which was something that was done in order, to encourage people to have cleaner cars.
What about solar panels? Because I'm thinking about getting solar panels. Am I screwed?
That's a good question. That's been an important part of the tax code, and I actually don't. This is where we're still today trying to understand exactly what's in this bill. But there are going to be little things in here that, depending on exactly, who you are and what your expenses are, will affect you. And again, the tax code is complicated. You can argue we shouldn't be doing all these things for the tax code. That's a reasonable debate to have. I think what's less reasonable from my perspective is arguing you should get rid of this stuff for super wealthy people.
And we'll know more about all of these deductions in the next couple days as we digest this.
Yeah, thank you for joining us on the day that it dropped.
Yeah, right. I'd like to pretend that I've read the full bill. That is not, I've read pieces of it, but I can't say I've read the whole thing yet. So.
Okay, Brian Brown is saying it is lowering the tax rate for small businesses. How about that? Isn't that important?
This is a great question because I think it gets to one of the more misleading things that's being done to sell this bill. So there's, small businesses, but also many wealthy investors and individuals earn business income through the individual side of the tax code. This is called pass-through income. So they might be part of an S corporation or part of a partnership.
An example of a profession.
So this is especially common among hedge funds and many large, sort of not large, but wealthy investment firms, law firms, lobbying firms. These are some of the examples. And actually, if you look at, the president, for example, and many members of his cabinet, they earn, or we imagine in the case of the president, because we haven't seen his tax return, they earn much or all of their income through this pass-through form. Now, it is true that many small businesses do get their income in pass-through form as well. But what this bill would do is lower the tax rate on pass-through income to a maximum of 25%. For the top income people, their tax rate is 39.6%. So that's a huge cut. You're talking about cutting their tax rate by more than a third. Now, the interesting thing is 86% of small businesses who have pass-through income are already at 25% or lower. So what that means is they get absolutely nothing out of it. Who gets a lot out of this? your lobbyist, your lawyer, your wealthy investor who is currently paying 39.6 and will now go down to 25. So we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars.
And is that basically because if you think about the small business that politicians talk about, a pizza shop, they're not making enough money to get the relief from it, whereas the hedge funds, which they don't like to talk about as a small business, they're the ones who are getting these small business tax cuts.
That's exactly right. And so, because what you have to remember is you're only paying taxes on your net income, right? So if you're a pizza shop or you're a bakery, once you net out all of your costs, the cost of paying your workers and the cost of making, a new investment in a new oven or, your tables or whatever you're paying for, you're often not
lucky if you're breaking even.
Right. You're lucky if you're breaking even, and you're certainly not making massive amounts of money. And so the people who do benefit and the people who benefit the most, where the money is here, is really you're talking about high-income investors. Now, they've talked about trying to do things to prevent, because what would happen, you'd imagine, is that really wealthy people would try to convert into this form. So if you're a LeBron James, you would go and become LeBron James LLC and be a sole contractor, contracting out to the Cleveland Cavaliers. They've tried to do things to cut down on that avoidance. It's almost impossible. I mean,
I'm sure they'll work very hard on that.
Exactly. And if you have a smart lawyer or a smart accountant, it's going to be, we imagine, pretty easy to get around those loopholes. So I think what we expect will happen is that anybody who has a lot of money being taxed at the top rate is going to have a huge incentive to try to convert their status to get this 25% rate.